Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in February of 2026, and there are quite a few, so let's go ahead and dive in. The first book that I read is called Franco. This is the third book in the Brightside trilogy by Kim Holden, and I think it's a trilogy. I think the series is done. And this is basically about a series of interconnected friends who in the first book experience a kind of just like this tragic situation, and somebody dies in book one. And then there's a couple different characters who have romances in book two and book three. And a couple of them are like bandmates, good friends. And one of the bandmates is the main protagonist in this third book. I really enjoyed this series overall. I feel like I wasn't sure after book one, but I'm really glad that I pursued reading the second and third books. Then I read the duology, What If It's Us and Here's to Us. And this is a book that is co-written by Becky Albertalli and Adam Silvera. And it's basically about these two guys who are kind of like college age, and they have like a meet cute at a post office in New York. And they have a relationship, and then they're friends, and then they go their separate ways. And then there's kind of a will they, won't they come back together question. And it's very much in the kind of like young, not young adult, I forget what it's called, new adult, I think is the framing of like people who are kind of like between like 18 and 25, people who are kind of in that age range. I really like this. I like Adam Silvera's work in general. I've read other things by him in the past and found this to be, a very kind of like sweet queer romance. Then I picked up The Fifth Victim by Dee Black. This is the first book, I think, in a series about a detective. And this one was like very traditional detective fare. I read it on audio. It's about a serial killer, and they're kind of like tracking all these clues. And like I said, very traditional in that sense. I really like that one. I would definitely pick up other books by this author. Then I read Mile High, but this is by Liz Tomford. It is the first book, and I believe what is now a 5-book series about different athletes who are having romantic relationships. The athlete in this particular book is a hockey player, and I have the second book actually already on my list to read for next month. I really like this. It's long. These romances I think are 500 to 600 pages long, and I was kind of wondering, how I would feel about that, but I ended up really liking this book. It definitely has some like two adults basically coming together, and they both have their own baggage. And this is one of like my favorite subgenres of romance, is like the realities of people coming together when they have past traumas, when they have past relationships that are really challenging. And we see that in this particular book. Then I picked up a book called The Yoga of Marketing by Gianna Valenti. This is a advanced reader's copy that I got from NetGalley. And what I will say is this book was a little bit like, I don't think I was the audience for this book, because there's a section in the front of the book that's on yoga stuff that I knew, like there was nothing really new there for me. And then there was kind of the second half, which is about marketing stuff. And I was wanting them to be integrated more. And I didn't really get that in this particular book. So if you're like brand new to yoga and you're kind of interested in how these things intersect, this might make more sense. I've been studying yoga for a very long time, and so it felt like a very kind of beginner's entry point to something that I was hoping for, something that was a little more advanced. The next book that I read is called Tough Guy by Rachel Reed. This is the third book in her series, which is called, I gotta look this up. I want to say it's called Heated Rivalry, but that's what the television show is called. The actual series is called Game Changers, and I believe there are 6 books in this series, and there is a 7th book that is being written by the author now. I actually recently saw the author on social media, and I didn't know this about her, that she has Parkinson's disease and is so kind of like battling that, and also, actively working on this book series that has gotten super popular because it is now a television adaptation on HBO Max called Heated Rivalry. And it is basically queer hockey romances about different players on these different hockey teams. And I've really enjoyed this series so far. I picked up the next 3 books in like a audiobook bundle, so I'm looking forward to reading those soon as well. Next, I picked up a book called ADHD is Awesome by Penn Holderness. And this is one of what I would say is a subgenre of different books on neurodivergence that are really talking about like practical ways to think about ADHD and to kind of, as the subtitle says, thrive with ADHD. And I would say this book didn't necessarily stand out to me among the others I've read. This is probably the 4th or 5th book that I've read on this topic. I like to get lots of different angles. I've been reading about neurodivergence for several years now, and so I just like to pick up the stuff that's like kind of popular and out there, see what people are saying. So I can't say that I wouldn't recommend this necessarily, but it didn't necessarily stand out to me as being especially good amongst some of the other ones that I've read as well. Then I read a memoir called A Mother's Reckoning. This is by Sue Klebold, who is the mother of one of the shooters that was part of the Columbine school shooting that happened in the late 90s. And she basically wrote a memoir about how some people kind of characterized her son as being kind of like a monster or, you know, somehow abnormal. And in this memoir, she talks about how he was actually very normal. And this is why it was so hard and kind of scary to realize that he could do this, because there was not a lot of signs, you know, that he was headed in this direction. And she talks a lot about like, what are we learning about school shooters? And this was actually a really interesting kind of a little bit like behind the scenes understanding of what her family and she was going through, you know, during this period of time. And I had seen this around, but just hadn't gotten around to picking it up. So found that really interesting. Next, I read a book called The Things We Cherished by Pam Janoff. This is a historical fiction book about two attorneys who are defending someone who is kind of facing claims that they had done war crimes in World War II. And so they have to kind of dig into the past and understand what happened. And actually, after reading this book, I went and got a bunch of other books on this author's backlist. I just thought this was super interesting. I really liked the interplay between past and present in this book. Really liked how she wrote kind of the strong female character. And the topic was also just super interesting. So I look forward to reading more of her books in the future. Then I read a book called Beyond Anxiety. This is by Martha Beck. Martha Beck is a very well-known and famous life coach. And so I often pick up her books, you know, when they come out, as someone who's a coach myself. And this is a book where she's really kind of trying to talk about her own experiences with anxiety, her coaching clients' experiences with anxiety, and the different kinds of strategies and approaches that she takes to try to kind of move beyond that and to have more kind of like groundedness in your life's purpose. I really like Martha Beck's work. I think that she also kind of leans a little bit into, I don't know what you might call it, like a little bit of the paranormal, maybe a little bit of woo. And I find that perspective interesting, whether or not I like completely agree with it. I still appreciate kind of the approach that she's taking to her work. Next, I read a book called Down Among the Dead Men by Michelle Williams. This is about a person who takes a job working in a mortuary and is basically talking about like the day-to-day experiences of what that's like. I thought that was super interesting. Like, this is something, I love reading memoirs about topics that are just completely unknown to me, and this was a really good example of that. Then I picked up Breathe With Me by Becca Mack. This is the 5th book in a series about interconnected athletes who are in relationships. I would give a massive trigger warning for topics around infertility because that is a huge component of this particular book. The main female character is struggling to get pregnant, and there are a lot of detailed descriptions of her emotions and the things she's experiencing around that. So if that is something that you tend to avoid, I would not pick up this book. That said, I did find it to be an incredibly emotionally resonant book. I appreciated the story of these two characters who've shown up like from the very beginning of the series. They've been kind of like an established set of partners and have been married like the whole time of the series. And we go back to kind of the beginning of the origin of their relationship. So I really thought this was great. I really enjoyed it. Then I read a book called Presidencies Derailed by Stephen Joel Trachtenberg. This is a nonfiction book, as you might imagine, about higher education presidents and why they tend to fail. And this is a book that's actually quite old. It's a couple decades old now, I believe. And it is also like a really interesting read because a lot of people, when they leave a presidency for various reasons, sign something like a non-disclosure agreement to say that they're not going to talk about what happened. And so the author of this book is like trying to understand that and talks to a lot of people around different situations of failed presidencies and comes up with a variety of themes of like why these kind of leadership positions are challenging and what kind of causes people to not succeed. And it's a relatively short book. It's only about 150 pages, maybe a little bit longer. And so I read it relatively quickly, but I really liked it. I haven't encountered much like this that kind of talks about this situation. And I think it ages well in terms of, it's an older book. It's talking about presidencies from a while back, but I also found it to be, super interesting and still probably applicable today. Next, I read a book called What Happens in Amsterdam by Rachel Lynn Solomon. And this is about a female protagonist who ends up moving to Amsterdam after, I think she's like fired from a job and then she's hired to a new job, and she just kind of like picks up her life and moves to a different country. And while she's there, she just stumbles into this man that when they were teenagers, he was like a foreign exchange student who lived in her house, I believe, like was with her family. And they got to know each other, and then they decide that they're going to do a fake marriage to help her get. I'm trying to remember, like she has like an unstable work situation in Amsterdam, and so there's some kind of reason why this is important for them to get married. What I will say is fake marriage tropes are my least favorite. I'm also not a huge fan of tropes around miscommunication, which is another kind of trope that often happens in romance. And this book had both of those things, so I struggled. That said, I thought it was a great depiction of Amsterdam, which I think the author is living, I believe, in Amsterdam. And so this was kind of her love story set in Amsterdam. And I really liked that part. I liked the place component of the book. Didn't like the characters as much, didn't like the plot as much. I think partly because of the different kind of tropes that were included here. But I like this author. I've read several of her other books in the past and will continue to read her books into the future as well. Next up, I read a book called The Embedded Entrepreneur. This is by Arvid Kahl, and this is a book that basically talks about how do you get a deeper understanding of what the audience of your business really needs so that you can serve them in a better way. And I really liked this. I feel like there's a lot about what this author is talking about that I've done in my own business, so it felt very realistic to that. There's maybe a third of this book that focuses on Twitter, which I found to be a little bit outdated, unfortunately. But the first part of the book, I actually really enjoyed and thought was really, really good. So for what it's worth, you kind of think about if that's useful for you. Then I picked up a book called The Dentist by Tim Sullivan. This is the first book in a series about a detective who is coded as being autistic. And I really liked this. I thought that this was like super interesting. I love police procedurals, and this kind of fell into that category. I would absolutely pick up another book by this author in this series. I just found the mystery itself to be very interesting, and also liked how the characters are being developed. Then I read Ask for Andrea by Noelle Ely. I've read this author before and enjoyed it. I actually really, really like this book. It's basically about a bunch of female ghosts who've been killed by the same man, and they are trying to stop him from killing again. There is this whole component of the book that is tied around the serial killer's wife and children, and like how they can be protected from him, which I found to be like really interesting. This was a page turner. I just kept kind of turning the pages on this one, read it very quickly. I understand there's a prequel to this as well, so I might consider picking that up too. Then I read a book called The Living and the Dead. This is by Christopher Carlson. It is a translated book from a Scandinavian writer. And it is about these teenagers who are at a party, and the morning after the party, they realize that somebody who was at the party has been killed. And so there's an investigation of kind of who was involved in this and why. And then it jumps to the future, and you're kind of understanding, you have to kind of go back and forth between the past and the future to understand what actually happened. I have been craving Scandinavian mysteries. I've got at least another one on my list coming up in this next month, and looking forward to diving deeper into these. And this, I think, was the first time I read this author before, but would definitely come back and see what else is in his backlist. All right, then I read a book called A Natural by Mia Sheridan. I have enjoyed this author quite a bit. I've read other books by her. This is the second book in a series that I believe is called Men and Monsters. And one way to describe this is I was riding home with my partner in the car, and I was trying to explain this book's plot to him, and he was like, "This is completely bonkers." And I was like, "Yeah, it's a really bonkers plot." So basically these two children grow up, and they're in different circumstances, but they're both affected by this same man who's kind of like an evil scientist. And the young girl has been exposed to this like drug, and it's kind of like the equivalent of like fetal alcohol syndrome in some ways. but not quite that. But it's just this idea that you're affected by like a drug that your parent has taken when you were being conceived and you were in the womb. And so she is raised in this like environment that is trying to treat her for this exposure. And then you have this other boy who has been kind of experimented on in this other situation, but they're both impacted by like the same like shadow organization that's involved in this situation. And they meet again as adults through a very unbelievable situation. Doesn't really matter. You have to suspend a lot of belief in this particular book, but they have a romance, and they're both like broken in different ways, but they met each other as children and they remember each other as children. They had this like very formative meeting when they were very young, and so when they meet again as adults, like they both like remember the situation. I found this book to be charming. I think partly because of just who the characters are. Again, like how it ends to me is like completely unbelievable as well, but I will continue to read books by this author, and probably books in this series as well if I see others that she puts out. Next up, I read a book called Team by David Allen. This is co-written with Edward Lamont, and David Allen is most known for his book called Getting Things Done. And I was a little bit worried that this book was just going to be like a rehashing of that with like some team applications. And actually, I felt like it was an entirely new, set of content and examples and kind of interesting approaches that were tied to getting things done and kind of that methodology, but also had more to add. So I ended up actually writing a review for this on LinkedIn in this past month because I just thought it was really interesting and helpful, and glad that I picked that one up. Next, I read a book called The Second Death of Locke by V.L. Bovolino. This is the first book I've read by this author. It is about a female mage and the knight that she is protecting. And it's kind of hard to describe anything about the plot of this because like you start to have some reveals like relatively early on. But just say that there's like some identity stuff that's happening in this book about people who are kind of having hidden identities that they're trying to be like protected and things like that. I actually really liked this. I think that it had kind of a bifurcated review. Like some people really liked it, some people liked it less. I was probably more on the side of the people who liked it. I liked the way that the author was creating kind of the ambiance, of the book and kind of like the tone of the book, and would definitely read, a second book in this particular series. Then I read As You Wish by Cary Elwes. This is his memoir about the making of the film The Princess Bride. I wasn't sure what I would think about this because I really do love this film. I've watched it multiple times. I actually really, really like this book. I thought it was like super interesting to hear all of the background. And I didn't realize that he and a lot of the people when they filmed this were so young. I think he was like in his early 20s. And so he talks a lot about like different people's insecurities on set and like what their concerns were. And I ended up just really, really enjoying this. I love the behind the scenes. At one point, he talks about like how he breaks his toe accidentally. And then he gives like examples of scenes in the movies where you can see him like being careful with his foot because basically like he couldn't walk. So just like those little like background things I think are super interesting. It'll make it really fun to watch the movie again. Next up, I read a book called Isn't It Obvious by Rachel Runya Katz. And this is a book about a woman who's a podcaster. And she's also a school librarian, and she has this man who is her podcasting like producer, basically an editor. And he ends up being someone that she's met in real life. And it's like an enemies to lovers situation where she does not like this man when she met him in real life, but she's falling for the person who is her podcast editor, and she does not realize they are the same person. And of course, this gets revealed later in the book. This was a book that when I first started reading it, I was having a hard time getting into it because I felt like the author was throwing in like every possible queer trope that they could think of. And it was just like, I'm not necessarily the audience for that. And it felt very heavy-handed in terms of like all the different things the author was referencing and like trying to make it, I think, just a very queer-friendly book. And I appreciated that to some extent, but also just I'm not necessarily the audience for that. And so I think that it took me about halfway into the book to really feel like I was connected to the characters and I was rooting for them and I was like trying to see, where this was going to go. So I ended up really liking this book, but I felt like some of the stuff early on kind of threw me off. And I would definitely pick up other books by this author. I don't know that I've read her before, so I'm looking forward to seeing what else is in her backlist. Next, I read a book called Group and Team Coaching by Christine Thornton. This is a book that is like very niche to the kinds of coaching that I do. I do offer group coaching in the past, and obviously coach teams in different capacities, for my work. And what I would say is like, this is a book that has more of like a psychological grounding than I was expecting. I thought it was going to be more practical and like with different approaches and tools, and it didn't necessarily have that. So there's probably other books on group and team coaching that I'm going to look to for more of like a practical grounding of how to do this work. But I did feel like this author obviously knew what they were talking about. I appreciated the descriptions they had for group and team coaching and how they were separating them out from each other. I agree, with the definitions that this person offered. So yeah, glad I picked it up. Next, I read Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody. And this is a book that is based off of another book that was for screenplay writing. And they also shifted it into this book on writing novels. And it basically takes apart the structure of a novel into certain different kinds of like plot maps, if you want to think about it that way. And it kind of breaks it down into like, I think 9 different ways that like different novels are plotted. And with like extreme examples and very detailed examples that are broken down, throughout this book about, what these different arcs can look like in the storytelling. I actually really, really like this. I think that part of why I liked it is because I knew all of the books that this person used as examples. I think there was like one that I had not read. And that helped me to really understand the material and what they were saying about this concept. And I would definitely consider like reading this again. If I was going to be writing fiction, I would absolutely be picking this up. So I can highly recommend it for that. Next, I read Skate It Till You Make It by Rufaro Faith Mazarura. And this is a book that was kind of perfect for the Olympics, which were airing when I was in this reading period. And it is about Olympic skaters and how they are, I think there's a hockey player and then the brother of another hockey player, both female hockey players, and they have a romance. And this takes place in like the Olympic Village. And so it was just fun. It was fun to pick that up during the Olympics being aired. Next, I read A Hidden Hope by Suzanne Woods Fisher. This is the second book in a series about a doctor that is former Amish, but is now a practicing doctor in an Amish community. And she has these medical residents who come and stay in her community and are trained by her. And there's kind of this like love triangle that's happening between these residents. And I really like this author. I really like her books. I'm totally picking up more in her backlist. I just find these to be almost like palate cleansers in the midst of other things I'm reading, because they're just very sweet, kind of romances. And the character development that's happening within this community is also just really fun to see. I also picked up this month the latest 2 books in the Cork O'Connor series by William Kent Kruger. The first one is called Spirit Crossing, and then the most recent book that's come out is called Apostles Cove. And this is a long-running series about a man who at one point is a sheriff. Now he is no longer a sheriff. Then he's like a private investigator. And his family, over the course of this series, like ages over time. So it starts the series when he has very young children, and then they kind of age into adulthood. Without giving too much away, several books into this series, I would say maybe like halfway into the current amount of books that are in the series, one of the main characters is killed off. And in one of these 2 books, another character is killed off as well. And so this author is not afraid to do that. But the first character that's killed off, and I don't want to give any spoilers, there's kind of this plot in one of these books where you go back in time, and that character is part of who becomes part of the storyline of like what has happened in the past, because they're still alive in the past version of the book. And I appreciated that as somebody who's been like a longtime reader of this series, to like see that character again and like how they were kind of like embroiled in that earlier plot. So I really do like this series. I'll continue to read it. And I find this author to just be like rock solid in terms of like every new book in this series. I just really enjoy. Also would just note that there's a lot of Native American themes that are kind of woven throughout the series as well, if that's of interest to you. Next, I read another memoir called Strangers by Belle Burden. And this is a book that was expanded from, I believe, a Modern Love column in the New York Times, if you're familiar with that column. And the author is basically talking about how her husband of like roughly 20 years, like one day just decided he didn't want to be married anymore. And her general concept of this book is like basically how somebody that you feel like you've known for a long time can all of a sudden just turn into a stranger that you just do not recognize, and you don't understand, like what has happened to them that has kind of made this like very big change, occur within her marriage and within her family. One of the things that took me a kind of a beat to kind of get over is this author and the person that she marries comes from wealth. And so there's like a lot of references to like buying second homes and like their prenuptial agreement and like various things that come into their relationship that have to do with money. And not to say there's anything wrong with that. It's just, I think, not something that everybody can identify with. And so there's an element of kind of that is coming into this narrative that is worth, just having awareness of, because I think it does impact some of her decisions in the relationship. It impacts her ability to talk about it, even in this memoir. So that was kind of an interesting layered component of it as well. I also read a book called Practical Ayurveda. This is by DK Publishing. It is kind of like this visual guide to Ayurvedic practices and Ayurvedic medicine, which is basically coming from, it kind of sits along parallel in some ways to yoga. And in my yoga studies, Ayurvedic practices comes up quite a bit. And so I wanted to do a deeper dive on this. This book talks about things like diet and movement and self-care and kind of how those things can be influenced by Ayurvedic principles. So if that's of interest to you, I would recommend this book. I also read The Castaways by Lucy Clarke. This is about two sisters who are traveling together, and one of them like misses a flight and one of them catches a flight. And the sister who catches the flight gets deserted basically on a desert island because the flight crashes. And then the other sister is looking for her and trying to find her. And so there's like a mystery, and you get to learn kind of what happens to both sisters, throughout this story. And I really, really like this. I would totally pick up another book by this author. I really enjoy castaway narratives. I have talked about them in the past. I just find them super interesting. And so, yeah, this was checking all of my boxes. I also read the most recent book by Julia Spencer Fleming called At Midnight Comes the Cry. This is the 10th book in a series that she's written that's a mystery series about a woman who is a veteran Army. I think she was like a fighter pilot, or she flew helicopters in the military. And then this man who's like a sheriff character, and they're in this small town. She also happens to be like an Episcopalian priest, and they end up in a relationship together. And over the course of this series, and I don't think this is really a spoiler, he starts out the series married. And so there's a lot of like angst about the feelings they have for each other, especially in the beginning of the series. And that relationship develops over time, not to give spoilers. But in this 10th book, this is about kind of like a white supremacist group that is being infiltrated by somebody that they know who's a police officer. And they have to like kind of rescue him from the situation that he's kind of infiltrated because he's in danger. And it has a lot of the characters who you've kind of like gotten to know over the course of these 10 books. Because the female main character is a priest, you also have this kind of like religious quotes and like other things that come into the narrative in a way that I actually find them woven in really well. This is one of those series, to me, it's just a beloved series. I think a lot of people really love it. And it had been a while since another book had been added to this. Not sure how many more will come out in this series just because they seem to take a while in between, but looking forward to reading any other ones that join the series. Also read the most recent Karen Pirie book by Val McDermid. This is called Silent Bones. And Karen Pirie, I think this was book 7 in the series, and she runs like a cold case squad and looks at cold cases and kind of how they connect to crimes of today. I always will pick up these books. I think Val McDermid is a fantastic mystery writer. I have loved her standalones. She also has a couple other series that she writes that I just found incredible. So really, really like that one too. Also, I picked up The Black Wolf. This is the latest in the Armand Gamage series by Louise Penny. As you can see, I read a lot of like very recent series editions. And Armand Gamage is like a small town detective, and this takes place in Canada. And I think, like there was something about this book that like I wasn't thrilled about. And I went and read a couple of the reviews, and it kind of helped me to frame in my own mind like what I found to be like problematic is probably not the right word, because I think some people would be fine with it, but what I was struggling with this book. And that is basically that in the beginning of this series, and I think this is book like 20, like, I mean, it's a long running series. In the beginning of the books, it's a very like charming small town, almost like cozy mystery series. And by the time you get to the Black Wolf, it is turning into this like international thriller series that is like nothing tied to this small town, and where it started. And I think that a lot of people were drawn to this series because of that kind of like small town cozy feeling. And this is like this like international crime conspiracy situation, and you have this same character from book 1 showing up in book 20, like, and it feels a little bit unbelievable. And a lot of the reviews commented on this, that if Louise Penny is going to go into kind of this like thriller territory, do it. Like, I think she's really good and I think she can do it, but to take the characters from this series and try to put them into that scenario doesn't always feel like it makes sense. So I liked the book. I liked the plotting. I thought it was interesting, but it was hard for me to kind of like square up in my own mind, like, that these characters have come this far in their own journey, that they've come from the cozy mystery all the way to the international thriller. So I will continue to read the series, but I missed the cozy mystery part of the first part of the series. Next up, I read The Irreverent Guide to Project Management. This is by Jason Scott, and this is a book that's very niche. If you are interested in projects and project management, you might pick this up. I actually found this book to be very affirming because it talks about a lot of the strategies that I currently use in a project management team that I oversee in my job. And so it was just kind of interesting to kind of look through and see those different things. But if you are not like in the weeds of like managing a project management team, this might not necessarily be something that you'd be interested in. Okay, then I picked up the 29th book in the Kay Scarpetta series by Patricia Cornwell. It is called Sharp Force. And I realized after the fact that I hadn't read book 28 in this series. I thought I had come all the way up to the most recent book, and it turns out there were 2 that I had not read yet. So I will go back and read book 28 in this next month. But book 29, what I really appreciated about it is the Kay Scarpetta series. You basically have, she's a medical examiner. And as I mentioned, super long running series. I mean, almost 30 books in this series. And in the beginning of the series, it was, like they do get a little bit dated because of technology and other kinds of things. So if you start from book 1, you're probably going to notice that. But there's kind of these traditional components of the series that are in, like, I would say the first 7 or 8 books of the series that I just really, really enjoyed. And then like the middle of the series gets a little bit strange. And a lot of people have commented on this. Like, the author brings in different elements to the series. Like she'll give like a serial killer like a very strange disease, and like these very odd characteristics that someone has. Or there's a couple of books where Kay Scarpetta is like very paranoid, and like it just has these strange elements, and it's like a departure from the early part of the series. Then the later you go, and I would say this last book that I read is getting back to more of the traditional components of the early part of the series that are just like very much like just a normal like police procedural, where there's a murder and she's trying to solve it, and she has these side characters who are coming in to help her. And I feel like the middle part of this series that just got kind of strange for a lot of people has kind of resolved itself, and it's like gotten back to kind of the more traditional components of what everybody loved, about this particular series. So it's worth reading all the way through because there's a lot of ups and downs with the characters. There are people who die off and then they come back from the dead, and like all kinds of things are happening. And I will always read this series. I think it's one that I just have a lot of nostalgia for, and I really enjoy it. All right, just a couple more. Then I read a book called Heart the Lover by Lily King. This is a relatively short book that is about a few people who know each other when they're in college, and they have like different relationships with each other of a romantic nature. And then they all grow up, they go their separate ways, and then they come back together as adults because one of them has an illness, and they're like kind of reckoning with each other about what happened to kind of like break them apart when they were younger. I like the second half of this book a lot more than I liked the first half of this book. I felt like the second half was a lot more just like, for me personally, like emotionally resonant. And it's kind of it wasn't a tearjerker for me, but I can see how it would be for other people in terms of like how the book ends, and what is kind of happening to bring these characters back together. I'm glad I read it. I mean, it's one that I've seen kind of floating around, and I don't know that I've read Lily King before, but I've seen other books of hers that a lot of people have really enjoyed. And then the last book that I read in the month is a book called If a Face Could Kill by Becky Masterman. This is the 5th book in the Bridget Quinn mystery series, and it is about a woman who is a retired FBI agent who ends up marrying a former priest, and they are older, like she is retired, so she is older, but she can't stay away from solving crimes. And so she keeps getting sucked back in. One of the elements of this 5th book, and I would definitely read them in order because of just the nature of how the series has evolved over time. One of the things that we see, I think it came into book 3 or 4, but it's definitely in book 5, is she has a niece who is a psychopath. And she is kind of trying to mentor this niece a little bit, so that she doesn't get herself into trouble. But this niece comes into book 5 and gets herself into a little bit of trouble. And so that's like part of the side plot. The plotting of these books, and this one in particular, it's a little bit bonkers. It feels a little bit all over the place. But I also feel like this character, Bridget Quinn, is just kind of unpredictable in terms of what she's going to do. And it makes for kind of a fun ride, in terms of the plot and following along with what her character is up to. So those are all of the books that I read in February of 2026. Some really good ones in there, and a lot of like very recent additions to series that got me caught up on all these series that I've been loving for a long time. So I really enjoyed that. Stay tuned for my TBR video for March in terms of all of the books that I'm hoping to read in the upcoming month. And until I see you again, happy reading.